Look what we have here. The help's little daughter thinks she belongs. Richard Blackstone's voice cut through his Manhattan penthouse as he pointed at 12-year-old Kaya Johnson sitting on the marble floor, doing homework while her mother Elena cleaned after his charity gala. 200 elite guests stopped talking, phones emerging as the tech billionaire's cruel smile widened. Tell you what, sweetheart, since Mama works for me, let me teach you about reality. He gestured toward his choreographer. See that routine? It cost me $50,000. Impossible to master. Blackstone's voice boomed. Dance this, and I'll give you $100 million. The crowd erupted in mocking laughter. But when you fail, and you will fail miserably, you'll tell everyone here that little girls like you should stick to mopping floors, not dreaming above your station. Kaya looked up from her math homework, meeting his gaze with unnaturally calm eyes. Have you ever watched a powerful adult decide to humiliate a child just for entertainment? The story of how Kaya Johnson ended up on that cold marble floor begins 3 generations earlier, in a cramped Harlem apartment where her grandmother, Sarah Washington Johnson, practiced ballet in secret. Sarah had been denied entry to every major dance company in the 1960s, not for lack of talent, but for the color of her skin. The rejection letters still sat in a worn shoebox, each one a polite variation of, not quite the right fit for our company's image. But Sarah never stopped dancing. In the tiny space between her kitchen table and sofa, she perfected every technique the white dancers performed on Lincoln Center's stages. She learned by watching through theater windows, by studying every dance magazine she could afford, by moving her body until muscle memory became her library of dreams deferred. When Sarah's granddaughter Kaya was born, those dreams found new life. From the moment Kaya could walk, Sarah was there, guiding her small feet through positions, humming melodies that turned living room corners into concert halls. "Baby girl," Sarah would whisper, as 4-year-old Kaya spun in circles. "They can take away our stages, but they can never take away our rhythm." Sarah taught Kaya everything: the classical precision of ballet, the storytelling power of contemporary dance, the cultural pride of African movement, the fire of Latin rhythms, the rebellion of street dance. But more than technique, she passed down something else: the quiet dignity of someone who knew her worth, regardless of who tried to diminish it. When cancer took Sarah at Kaya's 8th birthday, the child made a promise at the hospital bedside. "I'll dance for both of us, Grandma. I promise." 4 years later, that promise brought Kaya to Richard Blackstone's penthouse, seated beside her mother's cleaning supplies while Elena worked her second job of the day. Elena Johnson had dreams once too. Business school, maybe opening a small restaurant. But life had other plans. Medical bills from her husband's death, then her mother's cancer treatment, had consumed every penny of savings and every fragment of hope except one: Kaya's talent. Elena watched her daughter practice in their studio apartment, using YouTube videos and sheer determination to maintain what Sarah had built. She saw her 12-year-old move with the grace of someone twice her age, combining styles that professional dancers spent years mastering. But private lessons cost money they didn't have. Elite dance programs required connections they'd never possess. Tonight's charity gala was supposed to be different. The theme was supporting arts education for underserved youth. Bitter irony that wasn't lost on Elena as she watched Manhattan's elite sip champagne worth more than her monthly rent while discussing the importance of giving those children opportunities. Richard Blackstone himself had built an empire on the suffering of others. His social media platform thrived on challenge videos, where he publicly humiliated working-class people for entertainment. The janitor who couldn't solve calculus equations, the waitress who stumbled during an impossible service test, the taxi driver asked to recite Shakespeare. Each failure became content, each person's dignity sacrificed for views and advertising revenue. What none of his 50 million followers knew was how these challenges were designed. Blackstone's team researched their targets, finding people whose backgrounds made failure inevitable, then presented tasks that seemed possible but were carefully crafted to be impossible. The cruelty wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Earlier that evening, Kaya had watched Blackstone's $50,000 choreographer demonstrate a routine that combined 5 different dance styles in a sequence so complex it had taken the professional dancer 6 months to master. The choreographer herself had whispered to an assistant, "No amateur could possibly attempt this. It's professionally impossible without years of specific training." But as Kaya observed from her corner, doing fractions homework on loose-leaf paper, she recognized every single movement. The opening classical port de bras that Grandma Sarah had drilled into her muscles. The contemporary floor work that told stories of struggle and triumph. The hip-hop isolations that celebrated strength. The African ceremonial steps that honored ancestry. The Latin spins that embodied joy despite pain. This wasn't an impossible routine. This was her grandmother's legacy, translated into expensive choreography and presented as insurmountable. This was everything Sarah had taught her, repackaged and sold to people who would never understand its true meaning. In her worn backpack, hidden beneath homework folders, Kaya carried her grandmother's dance shoes. Too big for her 12-year-old feet, but perfectly maintained. She brought them everywhere, a talisman of dreams that refused to die despite 3 generations of systematic rejection. Now, as Blackstone's cruel laughter echoed through the penthouse and 200 phones captured her humiliation, Kaya felt her grandmother's presence stronger than ever. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper through the marble and crystal, "When they underestimate you, baby girl, that's when your power is strongest." The penthouse fell silent, the particular hush that accompanies public cruelty. 200 pairs of eyes fixed on 12-year-old Kaya, sitting on marble that cost more than most people's cars. "Richard, please!" Elena's voice cut through the silence as she appeared from behind the catering station, her cleaning uniform stark against evening gowns and tuxedos. "She's just a child doing homework." Blackstone's smile widened, sensing fresh content. "But I'm offering her the opportunity of a lifetime. $100 million. Surely you wouldn't deny your daughter such generosity." His voice carried false sweetness. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but phones remained raised, capturing a mother's desperation and child's humiliation. "Mama works 3 jobs so I can stay in school," Kaya said quietly, her voice carrying with startling clarity. She closed her math workbook with deliberate precision. 3 jobs because people like you think people like us are only good for cleaning your messes," the crowd murmured. This wasn't the expected reaction from a cornered child. Blackstone's eyes flashed with irritation. Children were supposed to cry or beg, not speak with quiet dignity. "Well then, here's your chance to change that. Dance my impossible routine, win your fortune. Or fail, and learn that some dreams are too big for some people." Kaya stood slowly, reaching into her backpack. She pulled out vintage dance shoes, clearly cherished, clearly too large for her feet. The leather was cracked but meticulously maintained. "These were my grandmother's," she said, voice steady as bedrock. "She never got her chance to show what she could do." Elena's eyes widened. "Mija, no, not here." But Kaya was already removing her sneakers, sliding small feet into shoes carrying 60 years of deferred dreams. As she stood, something shifted, a straightening that channeled generations of grace. The crowd sensed the change. Conversations died. Even Blackstone paused as he watched a child transform into something unexpected. Kaya looked directly at him, dark eyes holding impossible depths. "What kind of music?" The question landed like a challenge, not the victim's pleading, but the professional's inquiry. Time suspended as Kaya stood in her grandmother's shoes, worn leather connecting her to memories living in her bones. She closed her eyes briefly, and the penthouse disappeared. She was 4 again, spinning in Grandma Sarah's tiny apartment while Motown played. "Feel the music in your spine, baby girl," Sarah's voice echoed. "Let it travel through you until you become the song." She was 6, learning classical positions Sarah had practiced in secret for decades. "Stand tall, Kaya. They told me I wasn't good enough, but they were wrong. Talent doesn't have a color. It just has a heart." She was 8, holding Sarah's hand in the hospital as machines beeped their countdown. "Promise me you'll dance for both of us when your moment comes." Now that moment was here, disguised as humiliation, but revealed as destiny. Kaya opened her eyes, surveying the penthouse with new clarity. The marble floor became her stage, crystal chandelier, her spotlight. The skeptical crowd, her audience waiting for transformation. Blackstone was simply the obstacle between her and grandmother's vindication. "I need space," she said, a 12-year-old voice carrying unexpected authority. "Real dancing needs room to breathe." Guests stepped back instinctively, creating a circle. The movement felt ceremonial, as if unconsciously preparing for something sacred. Blackstone gestured at his sound technician. "Play the routine. Let's finish this." Kaya raised her hand, stopping him. "What happens when I succeed?" The confidence, not if, but when, rippled through the crowd. Blackstone's smile tightened. "You won't succeed, sweetheart. That's the point." "But if I do," Kaya pressed, eyes never leaving his face. "You keep your promise. $100 million for kids like me to learn to dance." "Not for me, for kids like me." The distinction wasn't lost. Margaret Whitmore, a silver-haired socialite near the windows, nodded approvingly. This child wasn't thinking personal gain, she was thinking community justice. Blackstone's jaw clenched. He'd expected tears, begging, clumsy attempts providing excellent content, not negotiation from someone who believed she could win. "Fine," he snapped. "When you fail, you apologize for wasting everyone's time and admit some people need to know their limitations." Kaya nodded, accepting terms. She pulled her braids into a tight bun with practiced efficiency, securing them with elastic from her wrist. The gesture was so professional, so prepared, that guests exchanged glances. Who was this child? Blackstone's sound technician pressed play, and the opening notes of the $50,000 routine filled the penthouse. The music was aggressive, demanding, a fusion piece that careened between classical strings, hip-hop beats, Latin percussion, African drums, and contemporary melodies. It was chaos by design, meant to confuse and overwhelm anyone foolish enough to attempt it. But Kaya didn't look confused. She looked like she was coming home. Her small body found the first position with liquid precision, arms flowing into a classical port de bras that would have made Bolshoi instructors weep. But before the crowd could process the perfection of her form, she was moving, transitioning seamlessly from ballet into contemporary floor work that used her 12-year-old frame like poetry in motion. The laughter died first, then the murmur of conversation. Within 30 seconds, the only sound in the penthouse was music and the whisper of bare feet against marble. Kaya's body told a story with every movement. The opening classical sequence spoke of dreams reaching toward light, her arms painting invisible pictures in the air above her head. When the music shifted to contemporary, she dropped to the floor in a controlled fall that looked like grief, transforming into acceptance, rolling and spiraling across the marble with impossible grace. Then came the street dance section, and something magical happened. Kaya's small frame exploded with power that defied physics, isolating muscle groups with precision that professional dancers spent years developing. Her head snapped to the beat while her torso remained perfectly still. Her arms told one story while her legs told another, every part of her body an independent instrument in a symphony of movement. Margaret Whitmore found herself stepping closer, her diamond bracelet forgotten as she watched artistry unfold. She'd seen professionals at Lincoln Center who couldn't execute transitions this flawless. Around her, other guests were lowering their phones, too mesmerized to remember they were supposed to be capturing humiliation. The Latin section began, and Kaya's hips found rhythms that seemed to channel generations of celebration. Her grandmother's heritage flowed through her like water finding its course, every spin a declaration of cultural pride, every step a refusal to be diminished. She used the entire penthouse as her stage, leaping from the living area to the dining space with grand jetés that carried her small body impossible distances. Blackstone's face had gone pale. This wasn't happening. Children didn't move like this. Working-class kids from the projects didn't master techniques that cost thousands to learn. His carefully constructed narrative of superiority was crumbling with every impossible transition Kaya executed. The African section erupted like thunder, and Kaya's movements became primal celebration. Her feet found rhythms older than civilization, while her upper body maintained the elegant lines of classical training. She was a bridge between worlds, honoring every influence while making them entirely her own. Elena watched from the catering station, tears streaming down her face. She was seeing her mother in her daughter's movements, Sarah's legacy living and breathing in Kaya's 12-year-old body. Every technique Sarah had been denied the chance to perform professionally was flowing through her granddaughter like resurrection. The music built toward its impossible climax, the section that had taken Blackstone's choreographer 6 months to master. 5 different styles had to blend simultaneously while the dancer executed a sequence of turns, leaps, and floor work that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Kaya launched into 32 fouettes, spinning turns that professional ballerinas struggled to complete. But as she spun, she began incorporating hip-hop isolations, her torso moving in opposition to her legs while maintaining perfect classical turnout. It was impossible. It was beautiful. It was everything her grandmother had dreamed of becoming, channeled through a child who'd learned in secret but performed like a master. The penthouse spun around her, crystal and marble becoming a blur as she turned. But Kaya wasn't dizzy. She was flying. She had every lesson with Grandma Sarah, every YouTube video studied in their tiny apartment, every night spent practicing in spaces too small for dreams but big enough for determination. As the final fouette completed, she dropped into breakdancing, her small body windmilling across the marble floor before flowing into contemporary spirals that carried her toward the penthouse windows. The Manhattan skyline twinkled behind her as she rose into a sequence of grand jetés that seemed to carry her above the earth itself. For the finale, Kaya found the center of the room and executed her grandmother's signature move, a leap that combined classical elevation with contemporary storytelling and street dance power. She seemed to hang in the air for an impossible moment, her body a sculpture of triumph against gravity, before landing in a perfect split that transitioned into a final pose with arms raised toward the crystal chandelier. The music ended. Silence. Not the silence of embarrassment or failure, but the hush that follows transcendence. 200 of Manhattan's most jaded elite stood motionless, processing what they'd just witnessed. Several women had tears in their eyes. Men who'd forgotten how to be moved found themselves holding their breath. Then Margaret Whitmore began to clap. Slowly at first, then with growing intensity. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly the entire penthouse erupted in applause that shook the crystal chandeliers. But Kaya wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at Blackstone, whose face had gone from pale to red to something approaching green. His mouth hung open, his carefully constructed superiority shattered like glass against marble. "That," said a voice from the crowd, Dr. James Washington, a prominent physician who'd recognized artistry when he saw it, "was the most extraordinary dance performance I've ever witnessed." Others nodded agreement. Phones that had been raised to capture humiliation were now recording genuine awe. The hashtags forming in real time weren't mocking, they were celebrating. Kaya stood in the center of the marble floor, still wearing her grandmother's oversized shoes, breathing hard but standing tall. She looked exactly like what she was, a 12-year-old girl who'd just proved that dreams don't die. They just wait for the right moment to emerge. "I did your dance," she said to Blackstone, her voice carrying clearly across the silent penthouse. "You promised $100 million for kids like me to learn." The crowd turned as one to look at the billionaire, waiting for his response to a challenge met and a promise demanded. For a moment, that stretched like eternity, Richard Blackstone stood frozen in his own penthouse, watching his world tilt off its axis. The applause thundered around him, but all he could hear was the sound of his carefully constructed superiority crashing to the marble floor, along with every assumption he'd ever made about worth and talent and who deserved to occupy spaces like his. Then his survival instincts kicked in. "Technical difficulties," he announced loudly, moving toward his sound system with purpose. Before anyone could react, he yanked the audio cable from the speakers, cutting off the final notes that were still echoing through the penthouse. "Sorry, everyone, but the music didn't complete properly. System malfunction." The crowd murmured in confusion. Several guests called out that the music had finished, that the performance was complete, that they'd all heard it perfectly. But Blackstone was already shaking his head with practiced authority. "House rules, I'm afraid. If the technical execution isn't perfect, the challenge doesn't count." His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to moving goalposts whenever the game wasn't going his way. "The routine has to be completed with full musical accompaniment. No exceptions." Kaya stood in the center of the floor, chest still rising and falling from her exertion, watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through his desperation. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply waited. Margaret Whitmore stepped forward, her voice sharp with disgust. "Richard, this is unconscionable. We all heard the music. The child performed brilliantly." But Blackstone was already signaling to his assistant, a thin man named Patterson who'd learned that his job security depended on enabling his boss's worst impulses. Patterson approached with a fresh glass of red wine, moving toward the performance area with deliberate clumsiness. "So sorry," Patterson muttered as he stumbled, sending Cabernet Sauvignon splashing across the white marble in a crimson stain that spread like spilled blood. "How clumsy of me. I'm afraid the floor is unsafe now for dancing." The calculation was obvious, the malice transparent. A grown man had deliberately sabotaged a child's moment of triumph, and 200 witnesses had watched it happen in real time. Phones that had been recording celebrations were now capturing corruption. Elena stepped forward from the catering station, her mother's instincts overriding any concern for her job. "Mr. Blackstone, please. She did what you asked. She danced your routine perfectly." "Did she?" Blackstone's voice carried mock sympathy. "Because I'm seeing a lot of technical difficulties here. Equipment failures, safety hazards. These things happen in live performances, don't they? Real professionals know how to handle adversity." But as he spoke, something extraordinary happened. Kaya walked calmly to the wine spill, her grandmother's oversized shoes clicking against marble as she studied the spreading stain. She knelt down, touched the edge of the liquid with one finger, then looked up at Blackstone with something that might have been pity. "May I use this?" she asked, gesturing to the mess they'd created to stop her. Before anyone could answer, she was moving again. But this time, her dance incorporated the wine spill like it had always been part of the choreography. She slid through the red liquid with controlled grace, using the slippery surface to execute spins that would have been impossible on dry marble. Her white leotard became stained with wine, but instead of looking damaged, she looked like a warrior painted for battle. The penthouse fell silent again, but this time the quiet was charged with something different. Recognition. Understanding. The growing awareness that they were watching something that transcended performance and had become pure art. Kaya transformed their sabotage into beauty. Every slide became a metaphor for resilience. Every spin through the wine spoke of taking what life throws at you and making it part of your story. She danced on the stain like she was dancing on their prejudices, using their obstacles as her stage. Elena's voice broke the silence, clear and proud and carrying 60 years of suppressed truth. My daughter learned from her grandmother, Sarah Washington Johnson. Margaret Whitmore's head snapped up, recognition dawning in her eyes. Sarah Johnson? The dancer from the 70s? She was denied every opportunity because of her color, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. But she never stopped dancing. She never stopped believing. And she taught my Kaya everything she knew. The crowd was processing this information, understanding flooding through them like wine through marble. This child wasn't some miraculous amateur. She was the inheritor of professional training, the granddaughter of a legend they'd lost to systemic prejudice. Dr. Washington stepped forward, his physician's authority lending weight to his words. I remember Sarah Johnson. She was extraordinary. We lost her to a system that couldn't see past skin color to recognize genius. Blackstone's face had gone from red to ashen. His sabotage hadn't just failed, it had created something more powerful than the original performance. And now the crowd was learning that his impossible challenge had been perfectly suited to this particular child, that his assumptions about who could master such artistry were rooted in ignorance rather than insight. Kaya rose from her final pose in the wine-stained marble, her grandmother's shoes and her borrowed leotard marked with red that looked like badges of honor rather than stains of failure. She had turned their weapons into her wings. The transformation of the crowd was visible, like ice cracking under pressure. What had begun as entertainment at a child's expense had become a reckoning with their own complicity in systematic prejudice. Margaret Whitmore stepped forward first, silver hair catching chandelier light as she faced Blackstone directly. Richard, this is beneath even you. This child is extraordinary, and what you've done is despicable. Dr. Washington nodded, his medical authority adding weight. I've attended Lincoln Center galas for 30 years. I've never seen artistry like this. The crowd murmured agreement, phones now capturing Blackstone's discomfort rather than Kaya's supposed failure. Hashtags formed in real time. Hashtag Kaya dance, #talent has no address, #Sarah Johnson legacy. Pay what you promised, called Victoria Lane, a prominent art collector. The child met your challenge. Other voices joined, creating a chorus of demand echoing through the penthouse. These weren't bleeding hearts. These were Manhattan's elite, people who recognized value regardless of packaging. Blackstone found himself surrounded by his own guests, his carefully curated audience turning against him. His social media empire was built on capturing others' humiliation, but now his own degradation was being broadcast by 200 phones. On Twitter, videos were already spreading. A 12-year-old transforming wine spills into art. A billionaire so threatened by a child's talent, he resorted to sabotage. The narrative was writing itself, and Blackstone wasn't controlling it. Kaya stood in wine-stained marble, still breathing hard, watching adults argue about her worth as if she weren't there. When she spoke, her voice cut through chaos with startling clarity. I did your dance, she said, looking directly at Blackstone. I did it when you tried to stop me. I did it better than your $50,000 choreographer. Her pause carried impossible weight. You promised $100 million for kids like me to learn. The whole world is watching now. Silence fell. She was right. The whole world was watching. Videos went viral before wine dried. Kaya Dance Challenge trended globally. Comments poured from dancers, teachers, parents, children who saw themselves in this girl who refused to be diminished. Blackstone's jaw worked soundlessly, caught between public promise and private humiliation. He'd built his fortune on others' failures, But now his own was documented by everyone who'd ever been underestimated. The first victory belonged to Kaya. But everyone knew this was just beginning. The first blow landed at 6:47 a.m. the next morning, delivered by phone to Elena Johnson as she prepared breakfast for Kaya before school. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and devastating. "Ms. Johnson, this is Patricia Miller from Premier Cleaning Services. I'm calling to inform you that your employment has been terminated effective immediately due to unprofessional conduct and violation of client confidentiality agreements." Elena's coffee mug slipped from her hands, shattering against the kitchen floor in a cascade of ceramic and brown liquid. "I don't understand. What confidentiality? What conduct?" "You allowed your daughter to disrupt a private client event and create a disturbance that reflected poorly on our company's reputation. Your final paycheck will be mailed within 2 weeks." The line went dead, leaving Elena staring at her phone in the growing dawn light. 3 jobs, and now she was down to 2. Kaya appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school, her dark eyes taking in the broken mug and her mother's stricken face. "Mama? It's okay, mija. We'll figure it out." But figuring it out became exponentially harder as the day progressed. At 10:15 a.m., Kaya's middle school principal called Elena at her morning cleaning job. "Mrs. Johnson, we've received several concerning reports about Kaya's behavior. Anonymous tips suggesting she's been seeking inappropriate attention and disrupting community events. We'll need to schedule a disciplinary meeting." By noon, their landlord had texted about urgent building renovations that would require them to vacate their apartment within 30 days. The rent-controlled unit they'd called home for 6 years was suddenly needed for family use. Elena understood the pattern. She'd seen it before, had heard whispers about what happened to people who crossed certain lines in the city's ecosystem of power and dependence. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. The media assault began simultaneously. Blackstone's publicity machine, worth millions and practiced in narrative warfare, launched a coordinated campaign across every platform where his influence reached. The headlines started subtly. "Young student disrupts charity gala." "Service worker's child seeks unearned spotlight." "Entitled behavior at fundraising event." But the subtext was clear to anyone who understood the coded language of systematic oppression. Uppity. Didn't know her place. Looking for handouts. Attitude problem. Blackstone's social media influencers, paid handsomely for their reach and flexible ethics, began posting analysis of Kaya's performance. Deepfake detection experts claimed the videos showed signs of editing. Dance professionals on his payroll suggested the routine was simplified and not as difficult as advertised. The comments sections are filled with bot accounts spreading poison, typical entitled behavior. Poor kid being used by publicity-seeking parents. Another family looking for a payday. Elena watched her daughter's triumph being systematically dismantled by people who'd never met them, never seen Kaya practice in their tiny apartment, never witnessed the hours of dedication that had built those impossible skills. Kaya herself said little, but Elena saw the change. The quiet confidence from the night before had been replaced by careful watchfulness. At 12 years old, her daughter was learning that standing up to power came with consequences that extended far beyond the moment of defiance. The worst part was the isolation. Elena's phone stopped ringing with cleaning referrals. Other parents at Kaya's school suddenly had reasons their children couldn't play together. The community that had celebrated Kaya's courage the night before seemed to evaporate in daylight, replaced by the careful distance of people who understood that proximity to trouble could become trouble itself. By evening, as Elena tucked Kaya into bed in their soon-to-be former apartment, her daughter asked the question she'd been dreading. "Mama, did I do something wrong?" Elena smoothed her daughter's braids against the pillow, remembering Sarah's voice. "They'll try to make you smaller, mija. That's how you know you're threatening their world." "No, baby girl," Elena whispered. "You did something right." That's why they're scared. But as Kaya drifted toward sleep, Elena stared at the ceiling and wondered if being right was worth watching their world crumble. Blackstone's message was clear. Challenge the system, and the system would challenge everything you held dear. The war had begun, and they were losing. The first unexpected ally arrived at Elena's door 3 days after the Penthouse performance, carrying an expensive briefcase and wearing the kind of understated clothing that whispered old money rather than shouting new wealth. Margaret Whitmore had spent 72 hours conducting her own investigation into Richard Blackstone's pattern of behavior. What she'd discovered made her stomach turn, and her resolve crystallize into something approaching fury. "Mrs. Johnson," she said when Elena answered the door, still wearing her uniform from her remaining cleaning job. "My name is Margaret Whitmore. I was at the gala the other night. I believe we need to talk." Over coffee in Elena's tiny kitchen, Margaret spread documents across the table like a general planning a campaign. Bank records, legal correspondence, media contracts, employment records from a dozen companies in Blackstone's network. "He's done this before," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "The janitor who couldn't solve his math problems? Dr. James Washington, former MIT professor who lost his position due to budget cuts and was working nights to pay his mother's medical bills. The waitress who failed his service test? Maria Santos, trained chef whose restaurant failed during the pandemic." Elena's hands trembled as she turned the pages, seeing pattern after pattern of engineered humiliation designed to go viral at the expense of people who had no power to fight back. "He researches them," Margaret continued, "finds people whose circumstances make them vulnerable, then presents challenges designed to highlight the gap between their current situation and their hidden potential. When they succeed beyond expectations, he destroys them." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Elena glanced at the caller ID and froze. It's Dr. Washington?" She answered hesitantly, and Dr. Washington's voice filled the kitchen through speakerphone. "Mrs. Johnson, I hope you don't mind my calling. Margaret Whitmore gave me your number. I've been following what happened to your daughter, and I think we need to stand together." Margaret smiled grimly. "James, tell her about Maria." "Maria Santos contacted me yesterday," Dr. Washington explained. "She's been documenting everything since her incident 6 months ago. Recording devices, employment records, the whole systematic destruction of her reputation. We're not Blackstone's first victims, but we might be his last if we work together." Within hours, Elena's apartment had become an unofficial headquarters for what Maria Santos dubbed the underestimated. Each person carried stories of talent hidden by circumstance, of dreams deferred by necessity, of expertise dismissed by prejudice. Dr. Washington brought 30 years of research experience and connections throughout the academic community. Maria contributed her chef's precision and her immigrant community's understanding of systematic exclusion. Margaret provided legal resources and social connections that opened doors previously slammed shut. But the most powerful ally emerged from an unexpected source: the dance community itself. Videos of Kaya's performance had reached professional circles where artistry was recognized regardless of its packaging. Alicia Martinez, principal dancer with the American Ballet Theater, posted a video response that went viral within hours. "I've been dancing professionally for 15 years, she said, addressing her camera with the intensity of someone speaking truth to power. "What I saw that 12-year-old do should be impossible. The technical skill, the emotional depth, the seamless integration of styles. This is the work of someone who's inherited not just training, but cultural knowledge passed down through generations." The post exploded across social media, shared by dancers, choreographers, and artistic directors who understood what they'd witnessed. Has Kaya Dance Challenge evolved from mockery hashtag to rallying cry, with young dancers of all backgrounds posting videos that celebrated skill over circumstance. Juilliard's admission board, led by director Elizabeth Harper, released a statement that sent shockwaves through the arts education world. Kaya Johnson represents exactly the kind of extraordinary talent our programs exist to nurture. We're offering her immediate admission with full scholarship, regardless of her current academic standing. The offer came with something even more valuable: validation. When Juilliard spoke, the dance world listened. When the dance world listened, other institutions took notice. When institutions took notice, media narratives began to shift. Elena watched her daughter process this information, seeing hope return to eyes that had grown guarded over the past 3 days. But it was Margaret who voiced what they were all thinking. "This isn't just about Kaya anymore," she said, looking around the cramped apartment that had become a war room. "It's about every talented child who's been told they don't belong, every family that's been systematically excluded from opportunities, every person who's been underestimated because of where they come from instead of where they're going." Dr. Washington nodded. "Blackstone built his empire on our individual vulnerabilities, but together we represent something he can't control: the truth." The allies had gathered. The evidence was mounting. And somewhere in Manhattan, Richard Blackstone was about to discover that crushing one family was manageable, but fighting an entire community was war. Lincoln Center's David H. Koch Theater had never hosted a mediation like this. The venue was symbolic, neutral ground where art mattered more than money, where talent was currency and truth carried weight. Margaret Whitmore had leveraged every connection to secure the space. Understanding location would send its own message. The live stream began at 7 p.m. Eastern, viewer counts climbing into millions within minutes. This wasn't just about a 12-year-old and a billionaire. It had become a reckoning with assumptions about worth and belonging. The panel represented institutional authority: Elizabeth Harper from Juilliard, Alicia Martinez from American Ballet Theater, Dr. Amara Okafor from the Institute for Arts Education, and Judge Patricia Williams, volunteering pro bono after watching viral videos with her daughter. Kaya sat beside Elena and Margaret, small frame dwarfed by theater grandeur but posture carrying quiet dignity that had stopped a penthouse full of adults. She wore a simple black dress and grandmother's polished dance shoes. Richard Blackstone entered with his legal team like an army preparing siege. Expensive suits and practiced confidence couldn't mask desperation. A man who'd built an empire on controlling narratives suddenly was subject to scrutiny he couldn't manipulate. Judge Williams called proceedings to order with the gravity of someone understanding justice was often theater, and tonight's performance would determine more than this single case. "We're here," she announced to cameras and packed theater, "to address allegations that Mr. Blackstone systematically targets vulnerable individuals for entertainment and whether he fulfilled his public promise to Kaya Johnson." Evidence presentation began with Margaret methodically laying out Blackstone's pattern. Video after video of challenges designed to humiliate people whose circumstances made them easy targets. Employment records showing coordinated retaliation. Financial documents revealing his charity was primarily tax avoidance. Dr. Washington testified about his experience, academic credentials lending weight to descriptions of engineered cruelty. Maria Santos spoke through an interpreter about systematic reputation destruction after demonstrating skills contradicting Blackstone's narrative. Most damning evidence came from Blackstone's employees. Patterson, his assistant who spilled wine, had been recording conversations for months. The audio was devastating. Blackstone planning sabotage, discussing discrediting a child's performance, laughing about putting the help back in place. Elizabeth Harper's words carried institutional authority. "In 40 years in arts education, I've never seen a more complete demonstration of inherited artistic mastery. What Kaya performed represents generations of technique and cultural knowledge that cannot be taught, only passed down." Alicia Martinez addressed cameras directly. "The routine Blackstone claimed impossible? I attempted it in my studio. It took 6 hours to master transitions Kaya executed flawlessly on first attempt. She didn't just meet his challenge, She surpassed most professional dancers. Blackstone's defense crumbled under cross-examination. Lawyers claimed the challenge was entertainment. Promises in social settings weren't legally binding, and the child's performance didn't meet professional standards. Judge Williams cut through arguments with surgical precision. Mr. Blackstone, you made a public promise to a child before 200 witnesses, broadcast to millions. You set terms. She met them. Your recordings confirm deliberate sabotage. What's your legal justification for breaking a promise to a 12-year-old? Blackstone's composure shattered. Faced with evidence, confronted by understanding his business model was predicated on systematic cruelty, he defaulted to driving prejudices. She's just a kid from the projects, he snapped, mask slipping completely. Her mother cleans toilets. What business does she have demanding anything from someone like me? Silence. The admission hung like toxic smoke. Not just class prejudice, but ugly truth about who he believed deserved dignity. Kaya stood slowly, commanding the attention of every person in the theater and viewer worldwide. Her voice carried the quiet strength of 3 generations refusing to accept others' limitations. My mama doesn't just clean toilets, she said, looking directly at Blackstone. She cleans messes people like you make because you think being rich means you don't have to clean up after yourself. My grandma taught me talent doesn't have an address, dreams don't have price tags, and dignity isn't something you give people, it's something they already have. She paused, theater holding breath. You promised $100 million for kids like me to learn. I'm asking for every kid told they don't belong because of where they come from instead of where they're going. Judgment was swift and decisive. The panel ruled unanimously in Kaya's favor, ordering Blackstone to fulfill his promise and establishing legal precedent for social media accountability. The pattern was broken. 6 months after the Lincoln Center showdown, the Sarah Washington Johnson Dance Academy opened its doors in a renovated warehouse in Kaya's old neighborhood. The building's brick walls still bore traces of its industrial past, but inside, floor-to-ceiling mirrors reflected the dreams of 60 children whose families could never have afforded private lessons. Elena Johnson stood in the main studio, no longer wearing a cleaning uniform, but a simple black dress that marked her new role as Executive Director of Community Outreach. The transition from service worker to nonprofit leader hadn't been easy, but Margaret Whitmore's mentorship and her own fierce determination had carried her through business school courses and grant-writing workshops. The $100 million settlement had been distributed exactly as Kaya had envisioned, not as a windfall for one family, but as a foundation for systematic change. 15 academies had opened across the country, each one bearing Sarah's name and mission. Talent has no address. Dreams have no price tag. Kaya herself was thriving at Juilliard's preparatory program, where her combination of inherited technique and street-smart creativity had made her a standout even among the most privileged students. But every Saturday, she returned to the neighborhood academy to teach the youngest students, sharing not just dance techniques, but the quiet dignity her grandmother had passed down. Dr. Washington had been hired as the Academy's Director of Academic Integration, developing programs that combined arts education with traditional subjects. His MIT credentials opened doors, but his experience as Blackstone's victim gave him credibility with families who'd been systematically excluded from elite institutions. Maria Santos ran the Academy's nutrition program, understanding that children couldn't dance on empty stomachs. Her professional kitchen provided meals for students and their families, turning the warehouse into a community center that nourished both body and spirit. Margaret Whitmore had surprised everyone, including herself, by becoming the Academy's most effective fundraiser. Her society connections, once used for charity galas that changed nothing, now generated sustainable support for programs that changed everything. She'd discovered that using privilege to amplify others' voices was far more satisfying than using it to maintain her own status. The impact rippled outward in ways none of them had anticipated. Other wealthy individuals, shamed by Blackstone's public disgrace and inspired by Margaret's transformation, began questioning their own philanthropic choices. Real change required more than tax-deductible donations. It required sharing power. Blackstone himself had become a cautionary tale, his social media empire collapsing under federal investigations triggered by the Lincoln Center proceedings. The audio recordings from Patterson had revealed not just individual cruelty, but systematic fraud, tax evasion, and labor violations that sent him from penthouse to courtroom to federal prison. His platforms were acquired by a coalition of nonprofits and converted into educational resources, proving that technology designed to exploit could be redesigned to empower. The viral challenge format that had once humiliated working-class people now showcased their hidden talents, creating opportunities instead of obstacles. But perhaps the most significant change was invisible, a shift in how stories were told and who got to tell them. Kaya's triumph had inspired countless other children to document their own talents, their own struggles, their own refusal to accept others' limitations as reality. The hashtag #talent has no address became more than social media trend. It became a movement that challenged every institution to examine its barriers and biases. Schools began scouting talent in unexpected places. Companies revised hiring practices that had excluded qualified candidates based on zip codes rather than abilities. Arts programs received funding that had previously gone only to elite institutions. Elena watched her daughter work with a group of 8-year-olds, patiently correcting their positions while encouraging their individual expression. Kaya had grown taller in the past months, but she still wore her grandmother's dance shoes for special occasions, honoring the legacy while building her own. The warehouse door opened, and Dr. Washington entered with a stack of college acceptance letters from students in their first graduating class. Full scholarships to institutions that had never recruited from this neighborhood before. Academic opportunities that proved talent truly had no address. "Your mother would be proud," Elena whispered, thinking of Sarah's sacrificed dreams now multiplied across hundreds of young lives. Kaya smiled, executing a perfect pirouette that seemed to channel 3 generations of resilience. "She knows, Mama. Every time we dance, she knows." Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythms, but something fundamental had shifted. Power had been redistributed, not through revolution, but through revelation. The simple truth that extraordinary ability lived everywhere, waiting only for opportunity to emerge. The system hadn't been destroyed, but it had been forced to expand, to include voices it had previously silenced, to recognize talent it had previously ignored. Justice, it turned out, looked a lot like a 12-year-old girl teaching 8-year-olds to believe in their own impossible dreams. 2 years later, Kaya Johnson stood center stage at Lincoln Center, no longer a 12-year-old fighting for recognition, but a 14-year-old artist performing her original choreography for an audience including presidents and janitors, CEOs, and children from Sarah Washington Johnson academies. The piece was called "The Space We Make," telling her journey from marble floors to main stages, from grandmother's oversized shoes to custom point shoes fitting perfectly. More than personal triumph, it celebrated every hidden talent-finding voice, every dream refusing to die despite systematic discouragement. Elena watched with streaming tears as her daughter executed grandmother's signature leap that once carried Sarah's dreams and now carried hope for an entire generation. Margaret Whitmore sat beside her, no longer the society matron attending galas for status, but the advocate who'd helped rewrite rules about who deserved opportunity. Dr. Washington and Maria Santos flanked them, each representing proof that second chances could become first-class futures when society stopped judging potential by current circumstances. The performance ended with a standing ovation that shook the theater's foundations. But Kaya wasn't finished. She walked to the stage front and spoke directly to cameras broadcasting worldwide. "My story went viral, not because I was a great dancer, but because I reminded people that talent doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs space to breathe." Her voice carried quiet strength that had stunned a penthouse full of skeptics and now commanded millions' attention. Today, thousands of kids dance in academies that didn't exist 3 years ago. They're learning their worth isn't determined by zip code, parents' jobs, or anyone's assumptions about what they can achieve. She paused, looking directly into cameras with those same dark eyes that had met Richard Blackstone's cruelty with impossible calm. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to believe adults who tell you that you're not enough. Because talent has no address, dreams have no price tag, and dignity isn't something anyone can give or take. It's something you already own. The motif had returned, transformed from desperate hope into established truth. As curtains fell and applause thundered, cameras lingered on a detail most would miss. Hanging from Kaya's neck was grandmother's ring, appearing in every crucial moment, reminding that some legacies are stronger than any attempt to silence them. If it were your child facing that billionaire's challenge, would you want them to have Kaya's courage? Share your thoughts below. Look closely at minute 432 of the Penthouse performance. Watch Kaya touch grandmother's ring before accepting the challenge. The strength was always there. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember their dreams matter regardless of what others think they deserve. Subscribe to Black Tales Stories for more stories of people who refuse to let the world make them smaller than their potential.